I'm Brynn Shiovitz, and I'm excited to be here with the Boulder Bookstore and to have the opportunity to tell you a bit more about my new book, Behind the Screen: Tap Dance, Race, and Invisibility During Hollywood's Golden Age. So the book itself is about a few things. First, the book traces a history of blackface minstrelsy, which I'll get into more soon, but on screen, and the covert means by which it entered Hollywood cinema, despite a production code that was put in place by the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. So in other words, the book really looks at how racial caricature, ethnic and racial caricature, was able to slip past these supposed censors that existed. The book is also about covert minstrelsy, which is the term I offer to refer to theatrical practices that assist in creating national unity at the exclusion of an other, so a marginalized group of people or person, through some kind of masking. So I discuss many, many kinds of masking throughout the book: blackface, brownface, redface, Jewface, yellowface, and many, many others. So these practices, what I'm trying to get away from is a certain kind of ocular centrism. So these particular practices that I'm discussing oftentimes resist visibility, which means they are invisible. So that means they can manifest orally, technologically, narratively, and even structurally, which is why they are covert. And they need to be distinguished from a very kind of classic 19th century practice of putting on blackface makeup, which was obviously highly visible. So what this means is that blackface and racist caricature don't need to be visible in order to exist. And actually, these invisible forms can be even more toxic than the visible ones. So I really unpack that throughout the book. And what I also really hope to stress is that blackface performance has been a part of the American narrative since really the 1820s, which is when minstrelsy really started. And because it has such a rich history that's tied to American entertainment, oftentimes it is associated with nostalgia. And so for people who weren't directly targeted by the stereotypes, by the racist imagery, those people often carry elements of nostalgia with them. And this becomes particularly complicated when that nostalgia starts to get confused with patriotism. So during World War I and World War II, a lot of these films really amped up the amount of racist caricature that they were using. And it is often put side by side with very patriotic imagery and songs, etc. And so that's when it becomes increasingly more complicated, right? Because something that is nostalgic for many becomes tied to citizenship, becomes tied to national pride. And of course, at the same time it represents that for one group of the population, it is putting down and doing damage to another group. So that is one of the biggest issues that I kind of unpack throughout the book. And then finally, one of the main foci of the book is to kind of stress the pervasiveness of the Africanist aesthetic. So that is basically a set of artistic sensibilities which can be traced back to the Black Atlantic slave trade and the lived experiences associated with that particular diaspora. So the book looks specifically at how less visible forms of blackface minstrelsy transitioned white audiences away from associating this Africanist aesthetic with Blackness, Black bodies, Black artistry with visible Blackness, while at the same time removing Black visibility from the screen. So literally removing Black artists from the screen, taking their name out of the credits, and just removing kind of the work that was required by them, and still utilizing an Africanist aesthetic: jazz music, tap dance, etc. So I guess I have some questions that I've been asked to answer. And here's the first one. What inspired you to write this book? So I actually was working on a master's at NYU and was planning on writing on very contemporary performance art for my final thesis paper. But my first love, I grew up tap dancing. I grew up watching all the Shirley Temple films and many other tap dance films. So my first love was always tap dance. And I love modern dance too. But it wasn't exciting me in the same way that watching old tap footage would excite me. And so I started rewatching some of these Shirley Temple films. And I realized there was a lot I didn't see when I was 5, 6, 7 years old, obviously. But this relationship between Bill Robinson and Shirley Temple is so complicated. And I was taken when I was rewatching the footage kind of in slow motion and just rewatching very, very carefully, that it appears on the surface that Shirley Temple is doing what Bill Robinson is doing, but she's not doing that at all. And he basically simplified the steps so much for her, as he should have for somebody who was just 6, 7 years old. But he dumbed down his own choreography. I mean, he was at that time the greatest living tap dancer, probably. And he basically sacrificed his own dancing to make this white star shine even brighter. And so it gives off the appearance of this young child doing the same things that this older Black man is performing, and yet she's not doing that at all. And she's getting the same amount of credit, if not more, than he is. And so that kind of began this troubling idea that she would get more credit than he did for doing less work than he did, and he was dumbing down his own choreography, and they weren't doing the same thing at all. Those disparities are what really led me to kind of further this research on tap dance. And not just that, but there is very little literature on tap history, tap scholarship. And so I really wanted to contribute to that. And then later on in graduate school at UCLA, I started getting more into kind of blackface minstrelsy, which it's easy to do if you're watching these old films with tap dance, because so often blackface was appearing. And so as I got more into that, it led to this whole project. The next question is, what kind of research did you do while writing this book, and how many films did you watch? So I actually did keep track of how many films I was watching, and I revisited that list, and I watched something like 230 films, which does not include the cartoons that I watched. And I think I watched at least half that many cartoons, but cartoons are obviously shorter. So I watched at least 230 films, and I just read countless books. So much of this research does not exist. And so many of the performers that I was researching have no literature on them. And so a lot of what I was doing was digging through old newspapers, trying to find names, performances, anything I could find to piece certain histories together. I did a lot of research at the Margaret Herrick Library in Los Angeles, where they have, production code files and things like that. So I was comparing imagery to what the files themselves said about what was allowed. I was even surfing through YouTube looking for old footage that, we have no recollection of who these artists are. And sometimes if you scroll down in the comments, you find people who comment, "Oh, that's my grandmother, that's my great auntie." And those are the people I had to contact, because there's no other way of tracing some of these histories back. So honestly, it was a combination of more traditional academic research, reading, watching films, etc., and then the not so traditional research of, digging through YouTube comments, digging through eBay, digging through all kinds of, sources that aren't necessarily traditional academic sources. It was really an archaeology. So the next question is, how did blackface minstrelsy first become popular in the US? And I want to preface this by saying that blackface minstrelsy is really the imitation of a Negro type. So that means that there's nothing factual about these portrayals. These are representations. And the only thing that's factual is that they are fear-based. They are based on the white imagination, and they were created as a means of further subjugating Black people. So this was going on simultaneously in England and the United States. And the first kind of record of a blackface performance is Thomas Daddy Rice, who began doing something called jumping Jim Crow. And of course, this performance is what led to the use of the term Jim Crow with regards to the Jim Crow laws, etc. And as we'll see, Jim Crow becomes an archetype. So this was around 1830, 1831. And in this performance, he put on blackface makeup, which has gone through multiple transitions over time. Newer models of it would be shoe polish, but back during Thomas Daddy Rice's time, most likely it was cork that was burned to create ash mixed with alcohol to create some kind of a paste. And so that's what he was using blackface, or that's what he was doing to put on blackface makeup. So he would put on the makeup, and then he would adopt a caricatured dialect. And that dialect basically consisted of broken English. That was really like an exaggerated form of broken English. Nobody really spoke like that. And so there's lots of problems with obviously the makeup and the way of speaking. But one of the most damaging messages to come out of this was that people like Thomas Daddy Rice were selling the idea that these were real representations of Black people and that they were based on empirical research. And of course, there is no traceable record of any empirical research, but this is what he told people to kind of prove that this was based on fact. So he and his contemporaries started building on this original Jim Crow caricature. And Jim Crow is, the most common one. He's known as the simpleton. He's known as the dumb fool. His costume is a bunch of rags. His shoes have holes in them, and he speaks in this broken English. Then came along Longtail Blue, which was really, the archetype was one of a Black dandy who dressed very, very nicely and actually spoke much more eloquently and was created basically just as an ironic contrast to Jim Crow. But then this kind of scared people that, that Black people could speak eloquently, that they could dress nicely. And so very quickly, there was a third archetype that was introduced, the Zip Coon character, who kind of straddled both of these worlds. So kind of mediated between Jim Crow's, simpleton character and Longtail Blue's dandy character. And so he comes out on stage wearing really nice clothes like Longtail Blue and becomes the butt of the joke very quickly when, as soon as he opens his mouth, he speaks in a very broken English. And the idea there was that, looks can be deceiving. So even if somebody is dressed very nicely, doesn't mean that they're very smart. And so the Zip Coon ended up being, I think, one of the most damaging figures of those three. And there were many, many other archetypes. Those are just kind of the three most common. But that is the beginning of blackface minstrelsy. And those were white performers performing those caricatures. But then very soon, Black performers started performing these caricatures as well, because this was a way that Black people could actually make money. And so, it wasn't so much a matter of choice as it was a matter of, being desperate to be paid for labor. And often these Black performers could make more money than the white performers because they would sell themselves as being authentic Ethiopians, which was the term that they used to show that they were, in fact, Black people performing these caricatures and that they could perform these caricatures better because they were actually Black. So this goes back and forth. And as you can imagine, the caricatures get more and more extreme as they go back from Black performers to white performers, and everybody's trying to one up the other performer. And this lasts for at least, 70, 80 years on the stage. It becomes a big part of vaudeville, which was a very popular form of American entertainment at the turn of the century through the teens. And then it slowly makes its way into film, which is why we see it in the very first Soundy, the jazz singer, 1927, Al Jolson puts on blackface makeup. So, and the book kind of, goes over this history, but then really digs into why did it make its way onto the screen when people knew it was so wrong at this point. The next question I have here is, what are a few of the ways the golden age of Hollywood put Africanist forms in a negative light? There are so many ways. So one really common narrative was to teach people that Black dance was dangerous, and that if you engaged in Black dance or listened to Black music, you would go to hell. And that might sound very extreme, but that's literally what these films were teaching. And I can trace it back to like Cakewalk Infernal, which is a film from 1903, where the message of the film is literally, if you perform the cakewalk, which is a dance that goes back to slave plantations, if you perform the cakewalk, you will go to hell. And it's this whole hellscape that is created. And it starts with God warning people not to engage in the cakewalk, and then people engage in it anyway because it's so infectious. And then suddenly everybody turns into like these demonic creatures. So there's that. We can trace that through. I mean, there were so many films in the 20s and the 30s that were still following that narrative, including one of the films I talk about in the book is New Faces of 1937. And the dance craze was called Peckin'. And basically the message is, if you start peckin', Satan is watching and you'll go to hell. And there's an actual 25-foot tall demonic bust standing behind people while they peck, kind of reminding people, and so much of this was motivated by the fact that the Catholic Church was paying for a lot of these films. And so these messages were put in basically to satisfy the Catholic Church. There had to be some religious message attached to them. And so it was, really a matter of economics and funding that was keeping some of these very racist narratives at play. So, I mean, there's so many narratives, but I think that is one of the most extreme and most pervasive, at least up until the end of the 1930s. Who are a few Black artists Hollywood omitted from the credits that we should know about today? So there are many, many, many. My one big goal of this book was to recuperate so many of these histories, but I could talk about the Three Chocolatiers here. So the Three Chocolatiers, Albert Gibson and Esmond Scott Mosby, and he was later replaced by another performer, Eddie West, and then Gus Moore. They were comedy dancers, and comedy dancing is a style of dancing that's extremely eccentric. There's lots of pantomime, and it plays a lot with like comedy itself. So they would crack jokes at each other, they would crack jokes at themselves, and it's a very kind of over-the-top caricatured style of dancing. And they were known for lots of different kinds of dances, but their most famous one is the Peckin one, and we can actually see them peckin in this film I was just talking about, New Faces of 1937. So before the film, they started doing a lot of dancing at Frank Sebastian's Cotton Club. So Frank Sebastian's Cotton Club was basically the West Coast version of the Cotton Club in New York. They got the same amazing jazz musicians, Cab Calloway, Duke Ellington, all of those, and they got great dancers. It was just the West Coast version of the Cotton Club. So they would perform there a lot. And Peckin first originated when Cootie Williams, who was a trumpet player in Duke Ellington's orchestra, in 1931, he just started riffing, and he riffed with this song, and the Three Chocolatiers happened to be there, and they just started doing this dance with their head, which was basically like this, pecking like chickens. And it caught on like wildfire at Frank Sebastian's Cotton Club, and in other Black vernacular spaces, it kind of slowly caught on. But it didn't really catch on until like 5-6 years later, when white jazz musicians started recording the same song. So they appropriated Cootie Williams' riff, which was improvised, appropriated that, started recording it, marketing it on the radio. So Jimmy Dorsey recorded a version, and Bing Crosby did the lyrics for that, or sang the vocals for that. And then Benny Goodman recorded an instrumental version in 1937, which was so popular. That was the one that was used for New Faces of 1937. And so that's the version that becomes like the theme song of New Faces of 1937. And that's where we see the Three Chocolatiers actually performing Peckin, which is great. They got to perform in the film, and they were paid for their labor, but none of them ended up in the credits. And so what ended up happening as soon as this film, so the film becomes popular, then people start buying the song. Benny Goodman's version becomes super famous. Cootie Williams basically evaporates his role in it. And the Three Chocolatiers eventually evaporate too, because they're not written in the credits. They have no copyright claims on the song, and it becomes associated with these white jazz musicians. And this is such a great example of, the process of appropriation that happened, that, so many of these white jazz musicians were actually taking improvised riffs and other songs from Black jazz musicians. And as soon as they recorded their versions, they became very popular. And then white people started performing the Peckin dance in their clubs. So anyway, that's the Three Chocolatiers and Cootie Williams, who kind of get written out of history quite a bit. But there are so many other histories in the book that I try to include that are as complicated and almost sad, right? Like that they gave so much to American culture and are so, they're all omitted from our history books. So now my next question is, what are a couple books you read during the pandemic that you really loved? And to be honest, so much of what I read was actually for like research for this book. That was the first half of the pandemic. So much of it was like the research of doing this book and watching the films, of course. But so I had read one of Colson Whitehead's books a while back, and I really liked it. But then when I had a little bit more time with the pandemic, I decided to go on a Colson Whitehead book binge. So I read The Underground Railroad, The Nickel Boys, and Harlem Shuffle, which they're all incredible. I just devoured all of them. He's so good. I love him. So what did I read? I read a lot of Colson Whitehead and then did a lot of research for this book. And the last question I have here is, can you read us a short passage from your book? And I would be happy to do that. So I open every chapter with like a very vivid description of a dance performance that you would have seen within one of these films. But I try really hard to frame the description to put you in basically in the theater. So you are now watching the film as a white patron in the year that the film was made. And so I'm writing it in a way that contextualizes what's going on with technology at the time, what's going on historically in the time, to really try and situate readers in these particular moments. And my book begins really in 1903 with Le Cakewalk Infernal, which I mentioned earlier. And I think I'll just begin by reading this very opening description of Le Cakewalk Infernal that I have. So this is 1903. A flurry of angels in striped leotards and whimsical tulle capes flutters across the foreground of an enchanted forest of cardboard geodes and stalactites. The glissando of a turn-of-the-century piano comically accents their frantic flying. Poof! A puff of smoke tries to conceal the shaky set change as the paper rock crystal formations vanish into thick air, and two masked tumblers jump out of the two-dimensional set. Somersault, handstand, backflip, roll, cut. Four masked men with flambeaux leap out of nowhere. They conduct the space with their flaming torches, providing the accompanist several opportunities to sync his sound with their movement, while also presenting what appears to be an extreme fire hazard for the spectator aware of early film's flammability and the extremely low-budget nature of this predominantly wood-furnished set. It's beginning to look a little bit like a Hieronymus Bosch hellscape. Jump cut. God, who bears a great resemblance to the Jesus found in 19th century Danish paintings, appears. He makes big prophetic gestures, but his exact message is lost in translation. Without audible dialogue, God's memorandum is difficult to decipher. Cut. God, played by the film's director, Georges Méliès, is now a Baphomet, also played by Méliès, clothed in an outfit resembling that of a court gesture. Poof. More smoke and mirrors. A flambeau appears in the Baphomet's hand, and he performs a solo fencing match. He drops the torch, and a small piece of the stage goes up in flames. Cut. The Baphomet vanishes, and fireballs float through the air so seamlessly that the men guiding their suspension are almost invisible. Poof. Two white dancers in blackface, dressed like the American stars Ada Overton Walker and George Walker, strut on stage and proceed to perform their rendition of the Cakewalk, the most popular dance of 1903. It almost looks like the dance the Black enslaved were performing half a century earlier. Little do these French performers know they are impersonating white plantation owners, or more accurately, these white performers in blackface are copying the performance of two Black stars who are imitating the performance of the Black enslaved, mimicking their masters. Cue pastry. Two white performers in blackface, dressed like Dahomean warriors, transport a giant cake to center stage. Is Méliès further alluding to Ada Overton Walker and George Walker in their successful run of In Dahomey, which is currently on tour in England and France? Is he commenting on the French takeover and colonization of the kingdom of Dahomey, which would very soon be absorbed into French West Africa? Winner takes the cake. Poof, a man, Méliès, dressed as a sabbatic goat or circus strongman, emerges from the cake center with calf muscles as round as the softballs with which he has stuffed his tights and horns as big and narrow as those of an ibex. Prance, hop, leap, kick, kick. The live accompanist is really having fun keeping up with this one. Only 1 minute left. Let's go out with a bang and show the audience just how far stagecraft has come since Loie Fuller. Amputated legs appear in the background. Splice. Now amputated arms. Cut. The live ragtime music escalates with the excitement of all these optical and technical illusions on the screen. Poof. Grand finale. Cue ensemble. Cue cakewalk. Cue pyrotechnics. Cue trapdoors. Cue blackface dancers. Sensory overload. I'd like to thank you all for listening and to Boulder Books for having me talk more about my book. Thanks.